Let us continue the journey here in looking at and exploring the possibilities that we can use adjustment layers with. Let's open up in our exercise files. Oh, this one right here from our friends at Photospin. These are all from Photospin, incidentally. Let's go ahead and open that one up. It's kind of like a sunlit tree path with a lot of shadows around and under those trees. Let's double-click the hand tool and bring it up a little bit more. Come over here. We'll use this button again right there. And when we select it, here's the second set, if you will. Now, the first set that we kind of looked at earlier in the last lesson, we just explored solid color. But all three of these create a layer of either a color, a gradient, or a pattern. These are more for image adjustment, image quality. You've got brightness, contrast, levels, curves, and exposure. Now, we're going to hit levels and curves pretty hard in this lesson series, so let's not worry about those right now. I'm not a big fan of brightness and contrast in photography, although it has been improved somewhat. Let's go to exposure. Let's use exposure. The exposure adjustment attempts to change the image as if we were still in the woods and still trying to take a good photograph and changing our shutter speed. And that's what it'll try to do. Now, we have three options. We have exposure, offset, and gamma correction. And we do have some eyedroppers down here, too, that allow us to make the samples on the image rather than fiddle with what's going on up here. And you do have some presets if you want to use them. Like a -1 would make it darker, and a +1 would make it lighter. Let's go back to default and do it ourselves. Before we start, though, there's something I want to say. To me, it's important that you change something here. If we go to the word image on the pull-down menu and go down to mode, you will notice we are in an 8-bit image. JPEGs are 8-bit, typically. I suggest you take this to 16-bit. Why? 16-bit images. Now, this image wasn't born that way. It's only an 8-bit image. I understand that. But it's like giving yourself more rubber band to stretch when you're editing the image. And I always recommend to my students that when you're working in image correction, whether it's permanently or it's through an adjustment layer or whatever you're doing, the image should be temporarily put into 16-bit to give you that extra stretch. So that's why we did that. Exposure, well, changes the shutter speed. So if we come over to it and click it, we can darken the image or we can lighten the image. And what it's doing, it's really kind of fanning out that histogram. So let's take it up and lighten it a little bit. Small moves are important here. You don't want to make large moves, you're going to flatten the image out. Offset kind of works the opposite, in my opinion, of exposure. Seems to work the opposite way. But in reality, it's working more with the mid to quarter tones. So it has a little bit more control. Now, if you go one way or the other way too far, you're going to flatten the image out. So you don't want to use a lot, but maybe I can lighten up the darker areas under those trees just a little bit without flattening it out too much. Doesn't take much to flatten it out. Gamma correction, to me, works a lot like the exposure controls in the RAW plugin. And if we come to gamma, maybe we can add a little bit of lightness to those trees, but as you can see, anything that I do beyond a very small range will begin creating the impression of the image being flattened out in color. So you got to watch what you're doing here. Down here, the eyedroppers, we won't use them yet, but what they do is they allow me to make the corrections up here by clicking on the image in the dark, in the light, in the midtones, if you want to use those. This button right down here will show you the before and the after. So if you click that button, you're now looking at the original. It's the same thing as clicking over here. Turn it on and off. This button says, I want to reset the whole thing. I want to reset everything. Incidentally, there is another trick here if you want to use it. If you want to reset any one of these values to its original value, come over to the name of the value and double-click on it. And it will take it and reset just that one. This one resets them all. Let's go ahead and take that back to about where we had it. Okay. This button right here will take you back, if you have one, to the previous change you made. This one takes you all the way back to the original. This one will take you back to the previous change. This button, I don't want this anymore. Get rid of the adjustment layer. And this first button over here, actually, let me move this over so you can see this. If I click that button, watch the exposure adjustment layer. So it pushes to the right, and a little arrow comes up right here, pointing down. What you're making is a clipping group. What a clipping group does is it only allows, in this example, it only allows that exposure to apply to that one layer directly below it. So in our case, we don't need it. We only have one. But if you have multiple layers in a document, exposure will drill down through all of them unless you click that button. Now, one more thing. We are still working temporary here, or what I would call non-destructive. There's nothing wrong with this. Let's say we like this to the point that we're ready to commit. Now, even if I were to do what I'm about to do, I would still have a copy of this original somewhere because this is my negative. But if you don't want the additional burden of the extra layer and you can't think of any reason why you don't love what you see, you can come up to this button right here, which of course is the options for the layers panel, and you can come down to any one of these three will work. Merge down makes it one layer of background. Merge visible, they're both visible. Flatten the image, doesn't matter which one you use, but what it will do is it will put it together in a permanent state. Now I can still press undo, but don't forget, if I save the document and reopen it, I'm stuck with what I did. On to the next.